Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. In this episode, I talked to Joe Baird, who is an impact investor both in Italy and in California. We've discussed many subjects from farm to fork, the chef celebrity movement, and his central theme in his work, which is farmers' health. How do we keep these families on the land who are producing our sustainable food, or how do we bring them back on the land? So when you look at farmers' health, it's about mental health, physical health, and of course financial health. And after the farmer is healthy, the soil will be healthy as well. Enjoy. Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, investing as if the planet mattered. Podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. Before we get started, I've been recording these interviews next to my day job, and I will definitely continue to do so and release about an episode a month. But at the same time, I would love to take this further, share more interviews. There are many more stories to share on investing in regenerative food and agriculture. More depth, improve the quality, maybe even doing some video series. So I started a Patreon community, which makes it easy to support creators like myself. If these podcasts have been of value to you, and if you have the means, I invite you to support me and make this happen. For more information, please find the link to my Patreon account in the description below. And now, without further ado, the interview. Enjoy! We're here today with Joe Baird, impact investing, who I met in Veglio, northern Italy, where he's introducing regenerative agriculture methods to restore the countryside, both ecologically and socially. He splits his time between California, where he's working both rurally and in urban areas and trying to connect those two, and northern Italy. Joe, very warm welcome.
Great, thank you, Koen. Great to be here.
I would like to kick off with a first question on why are you doing what you're doing? Because you could do many other things with your time, and you decided to focus on regenerative agriculture.
Mm-hmm. I maybe have a not such a unique perspective, but a perspective that I grew up in a rural area. I come from a farming family, but like many people, in fact most people, I migrated to an urban area. Happened to be Southern California. In an area that really it continues to experience hyper growth. And I saw the urban area grow, and I saw the rural areas really struggle. And people struggle to stay on the land. At the same time, this awareness of the problem of the industrial food complex, and I thought that there was something that was missing here in terms of really what was happening in the urban awareness, but then really a lack of awareness of the challenges of people actually trying to do this. And ironically, I saw the same thing in Italy, maybe even on a bigger scale, where Milan was thriving, but these rural areas were really struggling. And I thought that there was really, if I really was going to do something to help both the planet as well as society, that this was an important problem that needed to be solved. The theory of buying organic and whole foods, but then the reality of people trying to produce and stay on that land was a problem I felt really needed to be worked on.
Thank you. And so why northern Italy?
Family. So my family has been there near as we can tell about 1,000 years. And so my grandfather came to the United States in the early 1920s, but really he was one of 7. 6 stayed there, and so we have a lot of connections to that area that we've nurtured over the years, and it is home. It feels as much or more home than here in California.
And if you look at that area, specifically the villages north of Milan, northwest of Milan actually, there you're trying to work and trying to bring people back to the land and keep them on the land in a sustainable way, right?
We are. Yeah, this was the positive in a world of global warming and drought. This is an area that gets a lot of rain, and so historically there has been good sun exposure. The soil's decent, a lot of rain. So this was historically a fairly positive agricultural area. But because of urbanization, because of industrialization, people have really largely abandoned many of these areas, especially the terrace lands. And so, yeah, we're really working to re-energize both from a community as well as regenerate these lands that have been largely abandoned.
And by and doing that, you're trying to reconnect them to the bigger cities. Is Milan a target, or are there closer ones you're looking at to make that rural-urban connection again?
Yeah, I do believe. Certainly, Milan is an hour and 15 minutes by train. We are 30 minutes from Switzerland. Yeah, I think while there's a regional importance to connect to the local and regional markets, being part of a large urban market is important, certainly from a business model standpoint.
And then switching completely to the other side of the world, what are you spending your time on in California?
Probably two things. So I have connections in both far north California, which is a very rural. People think about the redwoods, but it's really the temperate rainforest and the agriculture sheds up in that area that I'm still very connected to, both from a family and friend standpoint. So working with those farmers and value-added producers to find new markets in more urbanized areas. And then here in Southern California, the challenge is a bit different in terms of just mass urbanization, where the loss of farmland, the drought. How do we find viable farming models in this periphery that really stops or slows down this where we're just losing farmland, and really most of the agricultural production is either in the Central Valley or quite a ways away. So working both at the not-for-profit level here in our community, as well as with young farmers and value-added producers, as they really try to find a business model to be viable in this kind of this urban area.
And have you found them already? Are there early signs of business models that are stopping this mass urban growth and actually are able to deliver products relatively nearby and sustainable both environmentally and socially? Are we too early from that?
Well, I think there's signs of hope, signs of challenge, I would say. Yeah, certainly in the value-added producers and in the brand building, there's such an awareness of farm to table, chef culture, etc. So there's a good push there. But then really the difficulty of buying and managing and developing what I'll call middle scale in terms of 80 to 200 acres. Those are tough models and in terms of how we find scaling for that. So I think that we're in the early days of that. There have been some steps forward that brave farmers and others have taken, but we're in the early stages of really viability of those models. Much more so in Southern California than Northern California. Northern California, in the Bay Area, they are probably 20 to 25 years ahead of Southern California in some respects, certainly in terms of the local agricultural support movement.
Mm-hmm. So you're really saying that, I mean, we've seen a lot of pioneers maybe on a small scale, and of course the huge industrial farms, but what's missing, at least in Southern California, is the middle size, which usually comprises most of the market, but in this case is not there yet. And how do you grow that?
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is just what are the models to make, how can a person, a family, be viable? A backyard or a small scale, an acre vegetable gardener, that's probably going to be a supplemental income, hopefully, not a family income, but
not a cost.
Exactly, especially in an urban area. Or even close to the urban area. So it's that, how do you reach something of an adequate scale, to be able to provide for a family.
Yeah, so that's if I look at your drive, but also your theory of change is making sure that in this whole transition and revolution in the agricultural space that we're seeing now, hopefully with more focus on soil, etc., that the land user and the land owner, the families that are working the lands and producing the food for us, are the ones that are also benefiting and able to stay or come back actually, which is I think a part that's often forgotten in the whole sustainability switch in agriculture we're pushing for.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's been my focus is really to start at the land and the soil. If we can't keep that viable, if we can't keep those farmers viable over the long term, we just have we just have this focus around the chef culture and branding of products. But then really our underpinning, our soil health and our farmer health really doesn't grow over time. And so it's for me it's a false sense of security. And what happens is that we'll end up shifting the dependence away from smaller farmers and into large scale industrial producers who happen to be organic.
Yeah, and so you might argue that it starts for you actually with the farmer's health, and naturally if the farmer is the farmer's family is healthy and working there, also actually the soil follows after that.
Absolutely, certainly, yes. I totally agree. Yeah, how do we find a model that that a family or families can live and thrive off of these lands, which is going to clearly require that we have a healthy soil and environment within that.
Extremely interesting, extremely interesting. So if we look at what's keeping you busy and what has kept you busy, if we look 1 year ago, so we're now in October 2016, we look 1 year ago, October, so let's say fall 2015, what has kept you busy in the last 12 months, and what are you proud of that you have achieved in the last 12 months?
Mm. Probably we've gone from theory to practice. I think that there was, if we think about the last 5 years, there's certainly this permaculture and all of it in all of its various forms have become fairly well known. The farm to table movement has been in full swing. So there's been a lot of awareness within this. But over the last 12 months, I think what we've seen is kind of people gone from trials and experiments to actually stepping out and making those first investments. So that's been the most encouraging thing that's happened in the last year is to see these various people, these various pioneers actually take the step out and find the way to make the purchases and begin viable operations. What keeps me up at night is that viability in terms of is there a support network? Is there add-on financing and patient capital that's going to allow this group of people to remain viable? So that's really what concerns me.
Yeah, and how do they get to the 200 hectares?
Exactly.
What investors and what type of investments are necessary for that?
Yeah.
And that actually is an interesting bridge to what if we look a year from now? So we're in September, October 2017. What will have changed? What do you hope has changed in a broader scale? So in the industry, in the regenerative agriculture industry, but also in your personal practice, of course.
Well, I hope more network and community. So in terms of first of all, this cannot be. This needs to be a broad-scale community effort, people working together. And so, in the old days, farmers, that was always a cooperative nature. This needs to be the same in this case. So I hope there's continued to be a lot of kind of this early stage group that continues to find ways to work together, both whether it be kind of in a broader sense of the word, but certainly regional. So where there's new models of cooperation. So that's what my hope is. Kind of at the financing or the kind of the rest of the ecosystem, I hope we continue to go from the hype of farm to table and this worship of the chef or the value-added producers to an awareness, continued awareness that we really need to focus around the producer as well, the farmer and the producer. And so that's what I hope. From a personal standpoint, we want to continue to make kind of more tangible steps. So in terms of finding models to make additional investments in agricultural land, finding continued pioneers that want to go back onto the land. How do we incubate those? So just more continued tangible steps that, again, as you've probably picked up on, for me it's about how do we get viable farmers on the land versus the value-added producers, which are certainly important, but we need to continue to focus.
Definitely, and the value starts at the land, and without that you cannot add anything later on.
Indeed.
And if you look at, so that's let's say a year from now, what kept you up from sleeping the last months? If you were working on any projects, on any investments, etc., that are hopefully now closing, you can share with us.
Mm-hmm.
But that kept you up the last few months.
The fears of young people. So in terms of what keeps me up at night is that they're, unlike perhaps people that are involved in technology or other earlier stage ventures, there seems to be a good support network for those people. But in terms of the people that are maybe taking a different path, what's kept me up probably more than anything is that worried about that those earlier stage folks are going to fail because of a lack of support, and both from a kind of a regional social system as well as others to get them through those difficult times. That's what's as we've talked before, it's really about the people and their personal aspirations, ability to sustain that sort of thing. And do we have enough of a social system around those people to get them, through those dark early days? And so that's probably what keeps me up at night more than anything.
Yeah, because if they fail, it sends a ripple effect through the whole sector, actually, especially if they're slightly high profile. Apart from all the personal losses you have when you fail something, and probably you won't try again, which is bad for all of us. How to get through the valley of death, which also exists outside Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and much more. It's much more of a concern in Europe than here. In California specifically, we have a history of experiments failed and keep moving forward. So it's probably more acceptable here, but in Europe and certainly in Italy, there is a stigma of failure that is really paralyzing. And that's certainly something that's really getting in the way of acceleration of these experiments that really need to happen.
And does it keep people from trying as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It keeps people stuck in analysis.
Because so you're saying that actually this culture of trying and failing is fine, also exists outside the technology space, but also exists in a broader, and in this case, agriculture space in the US, and it would be great if that would be shared more, because we need more trial. But it's not just technology where failure is accepted.
Absolutely. I think in failure, in terms of, I like to think of failed experiments. That does not mean a failure, right? So
trial and error.
Exactly. We have no choice but to take experiments, and they can be in whatever form those take, but we have to be in a mode of experimentation. And that's the thing that we're really, I see young people, especially in Europe, especially in Italy, totally paralyzed in many cases, and then not wanting to talk about it, really getting jammed up instead of having an environment where we're kind of working through these experiments, working through the trials, et cetera, to find the viable model.
And are investors ready to work on trial and error methods?
I think so. I think, and as long as we, like anything, we have to take a portfolio approach. So it's many experiments versus one big experiment. We have to, how do we find a series of experiments that then we can, then each of those learnings, you notice I didn't use the word failure, but each of those learnings needs to benefit others within the portfolio. And so again, with this is not in an isolation. We've got to think about this from a portfolio standpoint.
So there needs to be a lot of openness and sharing. Otherwise, the learning that becomes a failure because it's too isolated to be a learning for anybody else.
Absolutely. What a shame that is, in terms of just if we just see the negative part of the failing, right? So that it really the personal challenge, and then quietly they go back to their job in wherever, right? So
It's a waste. It's literally a waste.
it is a waste versus, it's shared with someone else, and they can either get back up and try something else, or someone else can learn from that and push the ball forward.
And how are you trying to do that in Italy, where, like you mentioned, the culture of failures, it's much more a culture of failures than it is a culture of learning?
Mm. It's difficult. I'll be perfectly honest with you, because there is a bit of a cultural clash, and that I think it's through communication, and we've talked that it's about meeting, it's about learning to talk about the benefits of both. That there is not one good model, and specifically, I think this is really where the connection between specifically Italy and California, or Italy and the United States, that it is not one, there's not one model that's better than the other. I think the models together are really powerful. One of the positive things about Europe and the Italian culture is it's a long focus. And I think if you combine that with some of the experimentation and kind of the California mentality, I think if you put those two things together, I think it really can help drive both forward. Both give a better perspective to Americans in terms of the impact and long term, as well as from an Italian standpoint. That there is a great upside that we live in a world where we have to experiment. And I think the other thing is that not just meeting, but bringing investors together, bringing international, specifically American investors with European and Italian investors to work together. So these learnings can be shared both at the investor as well as the entrepreneur.
And when you say together, you really mean together, physical, not just the online version, but bring them, for instance, in Northern Italy, in Veglio, to really share, I mean, as they in Italy do, share meals, etc., and really connect.
Absolutely. Share meals, share stories, share investments. Yeah, people getting to know each other, building trust, and then taking those steps of investing together.
That's extremely interesting. And you mentioned in the call we had before that you're working actually not only on the cultural barriers that there are to make this happen, for instance, to invest together in agricultural land in Italy and agriculture entrepreneurs and farmers, but also on the practicalities. You want to just briefly mention what you're working on that side?
Yeah, just in terms of the vehicles to be able to make investments together or manage lands together.
Yeah, definitely. When you mentioned it's both a struggle and an interesting discovery to see what is possible and where there are actually possibilities to do these things, because probably it's one of the first vehicles that somebody set up with this kind of focus and this kind of long-term focus as well.
Yep. Yeah, and we've worked with it's a puzzle, like anything in terms of the early stages are, but we've been spending quite a bit of time working with the attorneys, the accountants, the notaries, etc., on the Italian side to understand the pieces of the puzzle to be able to take these investments together. So specifically, how do we have investment vehicles that do really two or three things? One is joint investments by internationals as well as local Italians. Two, following a model of we believe that farmers need to grow into owners. How do we find a model that allows that to happen in a corporate structure? And then, how do we have the right lowest cost model to be able to operate this over the long term towards viability. And so we have been spending really quite a bit of time over the last 6 months with people both in the U.S. as well as in Italy in terms of what is the model. And I think we have some very good learnings and some first investment vehicles that we'll be putting in play hopefully next year.
Great. So that was going to be my next question, actually. When can we expect something that impact investors and investors from around the world can participate in? But you're hoping next year, which should be a great time in 2017.
Yeah, I think the second half of 2017. The first half is really sitting down across those tables with our local partners to understand. So we're communicating, talking about the pros and cons, the models, and then making a decision in terms of those first vehicles. So I think the timing is certainly 2017. We'd love to take that step.
Great. And so apart from these vehicles, if you have any advice for smart investors that want to get into the regenerative agriculture space, what would you be advising them to look at, to be careful for? What kind of lessons have you learned, and are you, of course, still learning?
Portfolio and portfolio across the value chain, I think, is going to be really important. So both at the farmer, producer, value-added producers, those sort of things. That's been my approach all along. But let's the full value chain. The second is beware of isolation geographically, and so we've seen both in the U.S. as well as in Europe. These regenerative hubs, if you will, need to be connected to urban areas. And so it works in tandem. Trying to be in isolation and support a market that's not connected to an urban center is really difficult, and I think that there is prone to failure. And so that would be the other thing is that just make sure that these hubs that you're looking at investing in, that we've got a really strong connection to the urban center and an efficient connection to the urban center.
Yeah, when you mention connection, do you mean the physical connection, so the distance, or social, or both? And what would be, because I think distances are different here and in Europe as they are in the US. What do you feel like is too much, or when it gets a danger to your portfolio, basically?
Yeah, I think it is certainly social, but geographic as well. I think that I think we've got to be careful in terms of, let me just give you an example. And it may not translate exactly to the European context, but in the Northeast, there are lots of successful examples of farms up the Hudson Valley and within a couple of hours of New York City. Those operations get very well connected to both restaurants that are sponsoring them, as well as farmers markets, as well as brands that are building within Manhattan. So those are working in tandem. And so, in fact, especially in the early days, from an investment standpoint, having that tighter connection and having that defined relationship with the urban market is really important. And we've heard this from other investors who have really been in very early, and at first were looking at very lower priced, large scale areas in remote rural areas. They really switched gears and really went back to this model where it's more of a hub and spoke in the urban areas, especially in the early days until we prove the models out. That would be another thing just to be aware of, that we've seen people all over, that this connection is really important, certainly over the next 5 years.
Definitely. I want to thank you so much, unless there's anything else you would like to share. And I can promise we'll be checking in regularly, and of course follow the different projects you're working on, and hopefully share that over the next years as well.
Great. Thanks, Koen. Best of luck.
You just listened to Investing in Regenerative Agriculture as If the Planet Mattered, an interview with Joe Baird, an impact investor. I hope you will join us soon for many more conversations with impact investors and practitioners on the ground, all working to scale the regenerative agriculture sector. If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerativeagriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? What questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, that doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.